summer day in 68 AD, a young man was pacing around anxiously in a villa near Rome. People near him could hear him mumbling, "What an artist dies with me." He was in a pretty hopeless situation. He knew his only way out was to kill himself, but he just couldn't find the nerve to do it. With a spectacular sense of entitlement, he asked some of the people with him to kill themselves first so that he could find the courage he needed. He couldn't convince anyone. Then he heard the horseman nearing the villa. He knew he had no time left now, so he stabbed himself on the neck and fell to the ground. The horsemen entered the building and they tried to save the young man, not because they loved him, but because they wanted to punish this enemy of the state in a harsher way. But it was too late. His dying words were, "Too late, this is fidelity." And this is how Emperor Nero, Claudius, Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus died on June 9th, 68 AD. Nero was born in 37 AD into the most influential family in Rome, the Julio-Claudian family. Though he was a baby, even Nero suffered from his uncle's whims when Nero's mother Agrippina was banished from Rome after Caligula and Agrippina had a falling out. Agrippina was sent into exile to a small island, and Nero was given to a relative who didn't have as majestic a life as some of the other members of the family. So Nero lived a relatively humble life for a Julio-Claudian until his uncle, Emperor Caligula, died in 41 AD. His education also wasn't anything special during this time. Nobody really doted on him. Nobody even thought Nero would be an emperor one day. But people didn't consider one person, Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina knew that in Rome only men's words were counted for something, and it was through her son Nero she could reach real power. So she made her plans and she married her own uncle, Emperor Claudius. This was very scandalous at the time because Claudius was Agrippina's paternal uncle. Romans view relative marriages like they're from Alabama, so they were usually pretty okay with them as long as the relatives marrying each other were connected through a maternal bloodline. So Claudius being Agrippina's paternal uncle was just too incestuous. Still, the marriage was going well at the start. Nero was adopted by Claudius, and this was actually the point he got the name Nero. He was called Lysius before the adoption. So after the adoption, Nero became an heir to the throne together with Claudius's biological son Britannicus, who was a bit younger than Nero. Claudius at first imagined them co-ruling the empire, but with some gentle directioning from his wife, he soon started to forget about his own son. Also, Britannicus's tutor was killed at this time after complaining that there wasn't enough attention on Britannicus's education. So the atmosphere was tense when it comes to little Britannicus, to say the least. Nero's star shone bright during this period, in which people who supported Britannicus's ascent to the throne met their demise in peculiar ways. But then Claudius felt they were all being a bit unfair towards his biological son and began to show signs of wariness towards his manipulative wife and adopted son. Agrippina, who had a lot to lose in the face of such wariness, didn't take long to decide. Claudius died by poisoning shortly after. There wasn't concrete proof about who and what killed Claudius, but at the time the general consensus was that Agrippina poisoned him. Nero also made jokes about mushrooms sending his father to the other world. As a side note, Emperor Claudius has a very interesting and sad story. If you like, we can talk about him in another video. When Claudius died, Britannicus hadn't come of age yet, so Nero became the sole ruler at the age of 16. And there began his reign, marked by his sadism, cruelty, and possible arsonistic tendencies. But before we move on to the rest of Nero's adolescent years, let's talk about this. Why did Nero leave such an awful mark in history? What made him different from all the other emperors who failed their duty? I'll get back to this subject throughout the video, but the first reason why Nero got all the hate is a bit surprising. Nero loved art with a passion. Music, theater, gladiators, he was into all of that. This love and passion for art would actually be okay if it wasn't for Nero's wish to contribute. He wanted to be an artist, he played instruments, he took roles in plays. That would be okay too if he was doing this between just family and friends, but Nero wanted to perform for the public. He went to Naples and did a play in front of large crowds, which is wild for his times because for Romans to use and show your body for entertainment was the most despicable, terrible act. So people who usually took part in such plays or any kind of show were on the lowest spot in the social ladder. They would live in horrible slums, and even though they were cheered on while they were on stage, people would avoid them like they were lepers in real life. So only slaves and freedmen would come and perform on stage. So we can say that their lives were very different from today's celebrities. Not only was he performing at times, but he was also hanging out with these artists and performers, which was socially equivalent to a prime minister today hanging out with prostitutes all the time. But the normal citizens weren't too bothered with it. It was the aristocracy. Literate, history-writing aristocracy that hated him for it from a deep place in their hearts. So when it was time to write about his life, we can say that nobody was hesitant to talk about his sadistic, cruel acts. Let's move on to those acts then. The first 5 years of Nero's rule weren't actually that bad at all because he wasn't the one making the real decisions. Nero was very inexperienced and he wasn't aware of the power he could wield. With the help of his mother and the advisors, he made some good policies and he already had the support and love of the public because he came directly from the first emperor Augustus's bloodline. And for Nero, that love and popularity was very, very important. We'll see the extremes he would go just to keep that love and popularity. But during these first years of his rule, a tension between Nero and his mother grew. As an example, Agrippina really wanted Nero to continue his marriage to Octavia, whom he married when he was younger and never really loved. Octavia was also Nero's stepsister, and their marriage was a good thing for the legitimacy of his rule. Nero, on the other hand, was deeply in love with someone his mother didn't approve at all. On top of that, there was some gossip about Nero and his mother having a scandalous, incestuous relationship. Nero wasn't happy about that either, but some say he was the source of the gossip. Agrippina, on the other hand, saw that she was losing control over her son and contacted Britannicus. She said she wanted to make him, Britannicus, the emperor. But then she made a mind-blowing strategic error and, like a villain from a B-movie, she told her plan to her son Nero, which resulted in Britannicus dying in very suspicious circumstances just a day before he officially reached adulthood. After all this happened, Nero decided to get his mother murdered. Historian Tacitus says Agrippina was all about taking antidotes regularly, so poisoning her wasn't a good solution. But when Nero thought, what can we do if we can't poison her, he came up with some wild answers. Nero, who couldn't resist theatrics and wanted to make his mother's death look like an accident, first tried to kill his mother by collapsing the roof of her bedroom somehow. It didn't work. Then he tried to kill his mother by sinking the ship she was in. But Agrippina was a good swimmer, so she survived this accident as well. She knew what was happening, but she acted like she didn't. For his third try, Nero sent someone to stab his mother to death, and this time the plan succeeded. Agrippina died in 59 AD. Nero killing his mother was a turning point both for his rule and his personal life. Maybe haunted by his guilt, for years he thought his mother was haunting him. And people around him understood that Nero wasn't a child they could just manipulate easily. Nero also lost some of his advisors during this period. Without the people who were reining him in, he got lost in his extreme ways of living. Again, during this period, his famous advisor Seneca realized his life was in danger and retired. Also, Nero's wife Octavia, who lived her life under constant threat of being murdered by Nero, got murdered by Nero. So while Nero was at a point in his life where he was going out at nights with his friends and mugging random citizens, a fire broke out in Rome. It was the night of June 18th in the year 64 AD, and initially it wasn't something so out of the ordinary. But this time it wasn't possible to put out the fire, not until it burned down 3 out of 14 districts completely. Another 7 districts were partially burnt down. The damage was mind-blowing. Immediately after the fire, Nero's actions were actually not that bad. He supported the Roman citizens by giving out food and shelter to the people who lost their homes. He helped them build new homes. Like we said, being loved by the public was more than a political move for Nero. He was hungry for that love for personal reasons. So he was more than willing to step up for the general public. But still, there was a rumor that he couldn't stop from spreading. This rumor said it was Nero who started the fire. Actually, when the fire started, Nero wasn't even in Rome. He was staying at his summer villa in a place called Antium. According to the historians, the night of the fire, he performed a play about the fall of Troy, and he used the fire in Rome as the background. Nero was such an extravagant person that people didn't find it all that hard to believe that he would start the fire just so he can have a dramatic background for his play. But the talks of Nero fiddling while Rome was burning is untrue. Though Nero was competent at playing a few instruments, the fiddle wasn't invented at the time. Another thing that really fueled the fire for this fire-starter Nero rumor was the fact that Nero took a big portion of the land that opened up with the fire. He used these lands for his Golden House project. The word house might be deceiving because it was a palace that used up a huge area in the city. It had vast gardens and even a lake. Nero also had a giant statue of himself here. It was somewhere between 30 and 37 meters tall. This Golden House is a very interesting subject because it shows how completely detached from his people Nero was. Rome was overcrowded and chaotic, and it was difficult to find a decent living space for the regular citizen. So for him to build himself this huge palace, complete with a vast lake and a garden in this crowded city, must have annoyed quite a few people. Nero didn't live long enough to see the completion of his house, but he moved in when the construction was finished enough for him to live in it, and according to some sources he said, "At last I can begin to live like a human being." After Nero died, the emperors that came after used the lands of this Golden House to build public places, so it became a PR tool to show the public that they weren't like Nero. For example, the famous Colosseum was built where the Golden House's lake was. The Colosseum's name comes from the Latin word colosseus, which means gigantic, but it's not because the Colosseum itself was gigantic, but because it was near the gigantic statue of Nero. Anyway, we talked enough about Nero's estate, back to the fire. So Nero grabbing land for his house after the fire and his apparent glee about the fire giving him an opportunity to rebuild Rome made the public more and more suspicious about him. Nero couldn't put these rumors to rest, and he needed to somehow turn this narrative around. He looked for someone he could use as a scapegoat, and after a quick search, he found just the people he needed. Without any concrete evidence whatsoever, Nero blamed Christians for the fire. I think Mike Duncan, who made the History of Rome podcast, explains why Nero chose Christians the best. According to him, Nero chose Christians because in 64 AD the Christians in Rome looked different from Romans, they spoke a different language from Romans, and their religion was strange to Romans with its slightly cannibalistic undertones. They were on one of the lowest steps in socioeconomic ladder, so they were a group of people who were liked even less than Nero, who was losing his popularity pretty quickly. It would be easy to get people to side against them. So Nero made this choice, and so began the interrogation and the punishment of Christians. What I mean by interrogation and punishment is that Christians were tortured horribly and confessed to the crimes under this torture. Nero brainstormed about the most cruel and sadistic punishments and came up with some really awful methods, such as feeding them to lions, or dipping them in wax and burning them at the cross. Christians lost their lives in horrible ways during the persecution. And though they weren't loved in Rome, the public began to find Nero's punishments too harsh and started to react. One of the most awful parts of this whole thing was how much Nero enjoyed these punishments. He would go and watch the punishments with open curiosity and even would use the burning people as torches for his garden parties. I don't want to delve too deep into this very grim part of history, but we can safely say that this extreme cruelty he showed during this time is one of the biggest reasons for his bad mark in history. As Christianity spread and Christians took more and more important roles in the upcoming centuries, they were the ones writing the history. And of course, they didn't find anything nice to say about him. Another very interesting thing about Christians and Nero is the number 666. For Christians, the number of the beast. According to historians, this number was symbolizing Nero, not the devil. Because if you write Nero's name in Hebrew numerological system, you get 666. Christians at the time were warning each other in coded messages, and it's thought that Nero was mentioned with this number, and the bad rap the number got actually comes from this. A year after the fire, in 65 AD, Nero's pregnant wife Poppaea Sabina died. According to some sources, she died during childbirth. According to other sources, Nero kicked her to death during an argument. Whatever the reason was, Nero felt immense grief or remorse after her death and gave himself to games and sport activities completely, and pretty much ignored the ruling the empire part of his life. He reduced taxes to win the public over and emptied the state treasury to complete his golden house. So the Senate at this point hated him with a passion. But Nero never really cared about those old guys, until he learned that he really should pay a bit more attention to them when he found out about an assassination plan in the year 65 AD. The assassination plan is called Pisonian conspiracy, and Nero found out about it by a bit of luck, not by a group of loyal people trying to save him. Fearing for his safety, Nero used this conspiracy as an excuse to kill whoever he liked, all the way to the people who he was remotely annoyed with. Even his old mentor Seneca was forced to commit suicide. But the more you killed, the more enemies you got in Rome, and that's exactly what happened to Nero. One of his last mistakes that brought him to the end was him forcing a war hero commander of his to commit suicide. By the way, if you're wondering, this forced suicide was a method of killing reserved mostly for the aristocrats. It spared the honor of the family, and the family usually also got to keep their properties after the suicide. Anyway, the killing of such a hero commander really annoyed and bothered the rest of the commanders. Nero now lost the support of the army along with the support of the Senate. Feeling that the end was near for him in Rome, Nero tried to go to the east where he was more popular, but even the soldiers at the harbor wouldn't take orders from him. Some even taunted him with the line from Aeneas, saying, "Is it then so sad a thing to die?" Horrified, Nero went back to his palace. He woke up in the middle of the night. He was deserted. None of his guards were in their posts. He called for his friends. No one answered. He called for a gladiator or anyone to kill him. They didn't answer either. Nero said, "Have I then neither a friend nor foe?" and left his palace. He went to a freedman's villa with some loyal slaves. He asked the slaves to dig his grave for him. While they were digging and while Nero was trying to get courage, I told you at the beginning of the video that Nero said, "What an artist dies with me." Another translation for these words are something like, "What an artisan I've became with that." He could be complaining about how demeaning his preparations to die were. With Nero, it's hard to know which it was. Nero committed suicide on June 9, 68 AD when he was 30 years old. He ruled the Roman Empire for 14 years. Some were overjoyed by his death and some were devastated, especially in the East. There were rumors about how Nero was going to rise from the dead, and there were even fake Neros claiming they were the reincarnation of Nero. Since Nero didn't have an heir when he died, his death brought the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Rome found itself in a huge power vacuum, and what followed was the year of the 4 emperors, during which the 4 most powerful men of the Roman Empire fought to become the next emperor. This dynasty change after Nero's death is one of the reasons why he has such a bad image. Talking shit about the last emperor of the last dynasty was the best move for the new dynasty. So Nero became the first emperor whose memory was damned, which meant they tried to erase him from the history. And this is the end of Nero's story. Let me know in the comments what you think about him. Do you think he started a fire? And you can let me know if you have a request for the next video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'd really appreciate it if you like and subscribe. See you soon!